Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this latest webinar from the World Broadband Association, co-sponsored by Omdia. I'm Martin Creaner, I'm the Director General of the World Broadband Association, and your moderator for today's session. And today's topic, very important topic, it's all around how can broadband networks meet the needs of tomorrow's applications. And this is aligned to the publication of the most recent version of the generational roadmap, which is a central WBBA deliverable. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. And before we get started, I'd just like to cover a few housekeeping items. So at the bottom of your audience console, there's multiple application widgets that you can use, and you make sure to check these out during the webinar because they will give you a better overall experience. You'll definitely be getting a copy of today's slide deck, and other valuable resources are available for download in the resource list widget. If you have any questions, you can submit them through the Q&A widget located in the middle of your screen. All questions will be captured, and if we don't get to answer you live during this webinar, we'll certainly follow up via email. There's an on-demand version of this webinar, and it will be available in approximately 24 hours after the end of this webinar. And finally, if you have any technical difficulties, just click on the help widget where you can find answers to some of the common questions, or you can put in a question into the question bar. We've got a great lineup for today's webinar. We have Michael Philpott, who's the Research Director of the Service Provider and Consumer Unit within Omdia. We have Dr. Marcus Brunner, who's the Chief Expert for Enhanced Broadband, and he's also the Chair of the WBBA's Generational Roadmap Working Group. And Marcus is from Huawei Technologies based in Switzerland. And we also have Kevin Hazley, who's the VP of Strategic Initiatives from Ookla. So let me welcome all of the three speakers. I'll come back and speak to you a bit later on as we get into some Q&A. But with no further ado, let me ask Michael to kick us off with some thoughts on the future of broadband. So Michael.
Yeah, thank you, Martin. So broadband networks have already developed massively since they first launched in the late 90s and early 2000s. First starting with basic ADSL type technology running on largely copper-based networks, which in some cases have been in the ground for many, many years, and was primarily used for internet surfing, offering kind of speeds of typically hundreds of kilobits per second. Then we moved to, I guess, more advanced versions of that same technology, and then moving on into kind of fiber to the cabinet, and then fiber to the curb, and then more recently fiber to the home networks, delivering speeds of, in this case, up to 100 megabits a second, and in some cases up to 1 gigabits per second. These technical developments led to changes in the broadband services that we receive in our homes today. The chart on the right shows a selection of key countries across the world. And across all those countries, if you move back to 2012, the maximum advertised speed that you get in any of those countries was 200 megabits per second. In some countries, such as China, as low as 20 megabits per second. If we speed forward to 2022, then 17 out of 20 of those countries now have an advertised maximum speed of a gigabit per second or more, including China. So that's an increase in speed of 5,000% in those cases over the last 10 years. And in 8 countries, then you're already seeing speeds advertised in multiple gigabits per second, and in 3 cases above 10 gigabits per second. And one might think that with all that development already happening, then such trends would start to slow. But in fact, the opposite is the case. What we'll see is just an acceleration of development over the next 10 years or so, as countries continue to move towards gigabit societies. And I guess this is, to some extent, the most controversial element of all this, because certainly as an analyst, we constantly get asked, what is the single use case, or what is the single application that really justifies the development of and investment in technologies that will deliver gigabit services down to the residential home especially? And the answer to that is, it's not a single use case or a single application, but actually a combination of multiple different trends that are all kind of happening and increasing at once. And the three of the most important are these. One is the exponential increase in the number and type of connected devices. Typically, the number of connected devices in a broadband home on average doubles every 5 years. So 2022, an average about 17. In 5 years' time, that'll be kind of in the region of about 35. But it's not just the number of connected devices in the home, it's that those devices are also developing. If you take the TV set, for example, which is still the main video screen in the home and will be so for the foreseeable future. Over the next 5 years, something like 93% of all shipments of TVs will be smart, as in they rely on the internet for their content and functionality. 30% of those shipments will also be screen size of 60 inches or more, and 76% will have shipments of resolution of 4K or better. But also you see new innovation going into the home. So 400% increase in the number of VR devices in the home, for example, and also new devices altogether, such as glasses-free 3D screens entering the home within 2025 and onwards. The next trend we'll see is then the move to continuous bandwidth-hungry applications. Today, we can accept HD video streams which highly compressed of using about 5 megabits per second. As we move to more advanced and better 4K type videos, then you'll start to see that doubling in terms of number of speed and up to 50 megabits per second in some cases. As we move to high quality 8K, then you're talking speeds of 300 megabits per second per stream. And then you move to high quality VR, you're talking 1 to 2 gigs. So you can see that as we get more and more devices in the home, they're all starting to access the internet at a time, and they're getting increasing advanced applications that require more bandwidth hungry. And then you can see that when you add all that up, it starts to get to speeds of gigabits per second or more down to the home. But the third trend then is an increasing reliance on the cloud, because today most applications that we use are kind of streamed in nature, but tomorrow's applications will be far more interactive and relying much more on the cloud, just as the kind of applications today. So there'll be much more kind of in time necessary in terms of those applications. And also there's another trend that devices are becoming smaller and lighter, therefore they have less compute power, less battery, and therefore have a much more greater reliance on intelligence in the car. So not only will these networks require much higher speed bandwidth, but also will have a reliance on a much lower latency, lower jitter, with a much higher reliability and consistency for those applications to function in the right quality experience required. And it's within this context that the World Broadband Association last year first developed its view on how the networks will evolve as we move to 2030, building a broadband roadmap around six dimensions. Yes, the ultra enhanced speeds, and you can see then the ultra reliability and consistency, and then enhanced connectivity to take into account all those different devices that will be connecting to the network. But also we outlined there will be a reliance on greater intelligence in the network to enable self-configuration and self-healing and self-optimization of those networks. We also outlined that those networks will need to be trustworthy and more sustainable as we go forwards. And also then finally, the greater sensing capabilities, so the networks have a greater awareness of their surrounding environment. Later on in the presentation, Marcus is going to provide more detail on all the metrics around those 6 dimensions. Before we get that, we're going to hand over to Kevin, who's going to look at a greater detail on the changing demands of tomorrow's applications.
Thank you, Michael. So we are Ookla, and we know a thing or two about the usage of the internet, the famous Speedtestnet that everybody in the world uses to actually show the speeds that they're running, the broadband, and show issues or show the speeds necessary for particular broadband applications. So on the chart, you actually see some of the expected speeds that you need to hit some of these demands in future applications. Cloud gaming is one where it's all the way from 30 megabits all the way to expectations of live 3D TV at 5.5 gig with 5,500 megabytes. But you see some of these transitional applications that are coming along the way, like Michael said before about 4K video, and TVs are already out there. More and more streaming applications are using or presenting content in 4K. Live TV is presenting in 4K. So 4K is here to stay, and soon we'll be looking forward to 8K with the realism that 4K brings. Obviously, VR is part of the conversation. We can't forget that, and the VR in the current generations, 100 megabits is required. But obviously, we haven't even tapped the use cases of some of the VR current generation. Obviously, when we think about VR, we think about gaming, we think about things that are standalone or sitting in one place and doing something so you have the maximum bandwidth. However, we see future trends of other applications that are using VR as the back end, but allows you to augment reality in a sense. And that's where XR comes in as you move to the right on the chart. In 2030 and 2034, you know, we all seen what Apple is doing with the Vision Pro, and we see a lot more real-time applications with that, the MetaQuest, all the other applications and VR situations. There's going to be a lot more of those applications that are going to be very bandwidth hungry, not only on fiber at the home connected, but wirelessly as well. So there's a lot of applications that are coming on board right now that is going to require a big bottleneck of bandwidth. And as Michael described in kind of the roadmap of where we're seeing some of the generations, hopefully we can get there a lot quicker because these applications are surprising everyone of how important, how precedence they are. Take a look at what ChatGPT has done. We are surprised every single day of the type of applications that are getting immediate kickoff and what's going to have longevity throughout the future. And that's where we come from with voice over IP call down below in the small chart in 2014 and 2015 with internet TV and 4K group video calling. We come a long way on what was required in the past and what we'll need in the future. So we're all looking forward to some of these technologies. And that's where really this webinar is coming from, and where the white paper is being written is what is the expected needs? What is the demand going forward? And how can we all work together to get there? And so if we look at some of the things that Ookla looks at, we look at the quality of experience. The need for high quality of experience on an end-to-end basis is the title of the slide. And it's really important that we match the expectations of quality of experience for any consumer, any enterprise, running certain applications, running certain scenarios, and the service level KPIs that the carriers, the MNOs, the infrastructure needs to support in order to do those. And the network infrastructure behind there needs to match. So you look at the KPI dialogue of the flow chart below, and it really gives you a sense of how we match the network KPIs to the service KPIs to the end application QoE. It's very important because what we all look for, what we look for at Ookla is really, can the networks actually handle those applications of today and possibly the applications of tomorrow. What's requirement, and are we getting there? It may be great in certain locations in certain countries, but overall, across the whole entire country, there's really big pockets still left to actually compete some of those needed service levels and network level KPIs. So that's really what this chart is trying to show, is those one-to-one mapping and how we can get there. And lastly, what I'll show you is some of the applications QoE requirements. The bandwidth requirements are looked upon as something of a target. So obviously, a lot of application vendors do a lot of optimizations on the network, on the application side, to reduce the need of bandwidth. But in all, to have the perfect experience, as we talked about in the flow chart, the best QoE, you got to really hit or try to target the maximum bandwidth that certain application is going to require, as well as, more importantly, the latency. Latency is a key factor to describe the QoE, because it's really, the reduction of user weight, or when you do something, will react to you over the internet. We could always think about latency with gaming, but latency is so critical across a whole bunch of applications, including just browsing the web, and how latency could affect a user who is trying to purchase something online to go into the next shop because that site didn't hit the request. So latency is a really key factor. So if you look down to the list of HD video call, bandwidth is 8 megabits, latency is under 20 milliseconds. So that, if you hit those two factors from the QoE side of the network and the infrastructure, you really get to see those two trends for the maximum HD video call experience. Down to cloud gaming, 30 and under 20, 4K video, 8K video. Remember the chart that I first showed? It's that 2025, 2027 type, when we start looking at the experimenting of 8K video and streaming that, which is mind-blowing at this point, because we're still not at the tip of the iceberg on 4K video streaming, but we're getting there, and it's coming faster and faster as we build these networks, as we build the infrastructure to handle it. The applications will come, because that's really where the revenue is being generated at, is these killer applications, we call it. I hate using the term killer application, but they are the applications that are really driving the growth of the internet, the bandwidth requirements, and the revenue in general. And then lastly, the high quality XR being everything, AR, VR, everything that augments reality to what you're seeing externally, or immersing yourself into that experience. And that's really what high quality XR is. And it's going to require a lot of bandwidth. We're just, again, today's VR applications are just scratching the surface of the true experience you can really get in VR. And we're really excited where it's going to go in the future. So what I like to do is transition to Marcus to take over a little bit of the next generation and what's coming in the future on the network side. Marcus?
Thank you very much, Kevin. Yes, let's look a bit into the future, starting from today onwards. So we really start today and look into the future. And we basically separated into the digital consumer residential-oriented aspects and the more enterprise-oriented aspects. So on the digital consumer side, we believe the connected consumer is looking for services, and Michael was already hinting towards that. You have all these things in your homes which are connected, of different types, very, very small devices, but very big devices, all of it connected. You basically try to bring sort of everyday objects from the physical world into the virtual world. You have a lot of devices which also rely on broadband connectivity to the outside of your home, specifically if they are connected to some sort of cloud infrastructure. Now, from a service characteristic, that basically means you have this IoT or machine-to-machine or machine-type communication service characteristic you need to look at. Specifically, this means you need to have fast reaction times. If a device sends something, it wants to get the reaction quite quickly. You need to have good home coverage. So the whole home needs to be covered quite well, that all your services are accessible in overall your home. And Kevin was already elaborating on it. You want to have this sort of more application-dependent quality of experience. Not each device is the same, not each service is the same. You have this plethora of different services which the network needs to deal with. On the immersive consumer, we just heard about all these different new immersive activities going on. So today we have this 4K I heard from Kevin. But we move ahead to higher Ks, but then also the people start socializing and work and consume entertainment services at home in a different way. So having these virtual immersive experiences which are created for home users will be sort of showing up in the future. And they are the first signs showing up with the devices coming along from the different vendors, different devices coming along into that area, different screens coming along, and so on. So basically, depending on the maturity of these devices and these technologies for the immersive services, they basically require definitely large bandwidth. We just heard about that. For example, if you transport 3D virtual models to your home and to render them, you need either fast reaction times or you need very high speeds or very high compute. So basically, this changes the way networks need to operate for this immersive consumer experience. The last one is the sustainable consumer. So sustainability is a very big topic. It's one of the dimensions we were looking at. And sustainability becomes a key element of the consumers making decisions, specifically if it comes down to buying decisions. It's getting more and more important. We believe also that real-time information to the consumer will basically let them better understand what decision he makes, what he does, and what does that mean, what type of sustainability KPIs they are, what the service is using in terms of resources along the whole chain. So this is sort of the consumer side. Then let's move to the application-driven enterprise. They are naturally the cloud. Nobody is able to get around the cloud anymore. Cloud is already mainstream today, and we believe it will even be more critical in the future, specifically if more and more enterprise workloads are shifting to the cloud. So far, a lot of cloud services are not very mission critical. So a lot of the more mission critical services and so on are usually still kept on premise. But if this happens, then the network needs to adapt to that as well. So the services will sort of more run out of several clouds as well. I don't believe that there is a single cloud doing everything. There are several different clouds, several benefits of certain clouds, different technologies, different baseline compute capabilities, from AI to just plain compute to other type of workloads. When, as an enterprise, you run to the cloud with your software and services, the work experience of the people needs still to be good in terms of performance and reliability. Otherwise, it has a direct business impact. So the networks need to cater for that aspect as well. And then if we are that concerned with the connectivity to the cloud and to the cloud infrastructure, we also need to look into the cloud networking or the data center networking, which also is moving to more all optical due to the speeds and due to the energy usage. So these are all aspects in the infrastructure and how you connect to that cloud infrastructure. Then another aspect we are seeing for the future is the adoption of variants of consumer technologies. The best example today is that mobile phones and tablets are sort of used first in residential or like end consumer side, but they are used today a lot in the enterprises. I mean, all packet services, all types of B2C or B2B setups, they use mobile phones and or tablets in one or the other way. The other aspect is we heard about VR, so this sort of mixed reality, virtual reality, toolkits are very good for visualizing complex aspects to humans, so can be used quite well in a lot of aspects. Then there is this trend of enterprise verticals where we need to look into more. From a broadband perspective, we have not really looked into that much detail into that. So there are several enterprise verticals. For example, the manufacturing side with Industry 4.0, there very complex manufacturing processes are digitized. For example, you have the automatic optical quality control, which is, as an example, deployed with an Asian manufacturer. There you have a very high density of communication in the shop floor, in the manufacturing shop floor. So you have like something like one machine per 10 square meters, and that the shop floor is full of those. So you have a very dense communication needs there. And you have a low latency need there because you want to have edge computing deployments in the factory or near the factory. You need to connect these machines to that cloud in the edge cloud. In the mining and power distribution area, there the operating is in a very severe environment, mostly in rather remote areas, mining definitely, but also other remote areas. So you need to look into the network from another perspective. Also, that it's not possible anymore to have unplanned operation downtime. If you have remote areas, you control something from remote, or you have power distribution, sort of unplanned operation downtime is absolutely unacceptable. And in healthcare is a very broad area where the adaptive networking is needed, because there are that many different scenarios in healthcare, being at home, being elderly care, being in hospitals, being about patient data in terms of videos and medical images and so on. So you need to have this adaptation to the different applications in healthcare, which have very different needs. Over all of that, there's a very high level of security and privacy needed because it's your personal data which is handled there. Finally, the impact of high performance computing on networks is interesting to look into, because the need is for all sorts of artificial intelligence tasks, from the training to really executing on artificial intelligence algorithms, which need quite a high compute power. And you need to have the flexibility of the workload assignments, because it's not exactly clear where you need it. When you want to have very low latency, you need to run the compute in the edge. If you want to have a high multiplexing gain, you run the compute as central as possible. If you need particular AI tasks which need certain compute infrastructure, you need to run it where this compute infrastructure is available. And all of those compute infrastructure needs to be interconnected by networking capabilities. And finally, in the data center itself, the AI algorithms have these characteristics that the interaction between several compute elements is needed, which basically means you need to improve the networking in the data center as such as well. With that, I come to the more technical characteristics. And again, on the residential side, basically, bear with me, it's sort of like quite a big table, but you can go and have a look at that in the white paper, which is published. Michael was already talking about the different generations. We are looking into it. I just quickly want to go through the broadband 5.5 and broadband 6 generation, because those are the more forward-looking generation. So broadband 5.5, the talk is having 10 gigabit broadband as a reference, which basically means somewhere in the 5 to 25 gig per user downstream and 5 to 25 gig per user upstream. The typical services are extended reality, metaverse, digital twin, industrial optical networking. I elaborated on some of that. The specification timeline is sort of starting from today onwards. The ETSI IFG F5G started work towards the F5G Advanced, how it's called there, just a few months ago. So the specification is ongoing. Some of the technologies are already specified. So this whole area is sort of under specification and will show up soon on the market. The reference bandwidth on the aggregation core networks is in the 400 to 800 gig. Michael elaborated already. One aspect is the autonomous networking level. So how autonomous and how automatic the network is operated. We expect to be on level 4 on that. We use the TM Forum classification numbers here. Then one new topic which comes in with that generation is the capability for sensing. And the first application for that in that generation is expected to be optimizing O&M, that you have better sensing capabilities in the optical network. And then naturally the green aspect is have much higher energy efficiency. Now moving ahead a bit more in the future, now it gets even more blurry. So the broadband 6 generation, this is sort of expectations, and this is sort of like the current trend based on the numbers you have seen from Kevin and Michael. The expectation is that we move to this broadband 6 more in the long term. That's more in the 25 to 100 gig per user. We expect to have more optical to the room, optical to the machine, optical to the thing, and fiber sensing capability. If I say optical, it's not meaning it's just not only fiber, but it's also less electricity used for the networking nodes. So going much more optical along the way. And this is expected to start its specification somewhere in the 27 and beyond timeframe, and will carry us along. The reference bandwidth for aggregation core is then going to more towards the 800 gig, 1.6 tera, and we want to have a sort of fully autonomous network. On the sensing capabilities, there are more sensing also used for all different types of application, not only for the sort of O&M type of application, but also have more computing awareness, that the computer can, computing tasks can take that into account. And naturally, we need to do more greener aspects of that. So that was the residential part. On the enterprise aspects, there again, we have the broadband 5.5, broadband 6. And there we have a bit of a different situation. I don't go into everything, with some of them is sort of like very similar. I just concentrate on the things which are different. There's one thing which is really different, is that enterprises are more diverse, from the very small enterprises to the very big ones. So basically the bandwidth per service or enterprise needs to be much more flexible and much more adjustable. So we leave for broadband 5.5 from 2 megabit to 400 gig. Is sort of very wide span, which we need to be able to deliver depending on the enterprise and the situation. Then also the bandwidth on the data center itself. So that's sort of like in the data center. We start with the 800 gig, sort of in BB 5.5, and believe it goes up to 3.2 tera, like within data center bandwidth for the networking. The reference scenarios include a lot of data center interconnect, enterprise IT, cloudification, digitalization of the industry, going multi-cloud, having HD online meetings, remote office with high-speed access, things like that. And then, as said, some of the consumer-oriented devices will come into the enterprise space as well. So we need the AR, VR meeting applications can come, or we have like distributed mobile edge computing, doing more on the edge because we need very low latency. And some of the other aspects are pretty similar. One aspect is really the reliability and latency. Again, depending on the enterprise, we need to have very low latency or very high reliability. So this is, I mean, again, it depends on the scenario. But if you control a robot arm, you need a lower than 1 millisecond latency, and you want to have very fast problem detection if something goes wrong, which should not. So it should be very highly reliable. So these are the things we look into. With that, in the paper, we also have like 2 other aspects, which I have not put on slides here. One aspect is that this roadmap is also trying to show the different standardization organization and the industry sort of what standards are needed along the way. So it should have drive a little bit the standardization activities in the industry. And the second thing is we talked a lot about fiber, but we should not forget that the copper phase out is an important topic as well, because otherwise you are not able to cash in on the energy saving. You end up running 2 networks in parallel, which is not helpful for anybody. With that, I hand back to Martin. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Marcus, and thanks to Michael and Kevin also for a really interesting and broad set of views in terms of where the industry is going and what are the current challenges we're facing, what are the current opportunities. We now have about 20 minutes to go through some Q&A. So if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A box, and we will get to them if we can, and we'll certainly find a way of answering them if we can't get to them live. Maybe I'll just kick off first, Marcus, with you, which is, you know, we talked about a roadmap, a generational roadmap, and if we take a step up and look at this from a height, what's the real reason for why do we bother creating a generational roadmap? And you know, how would you summarize the key benefits of a generational roadmap?
Yeah, that's a very big question, Martin. There are various aspects for a roadmap. First of all, we believe that the industry in the broadband space needs to get together and try to figure out what is needed in the future. So basically showing the future, discussing the future, what are the new services, new applications coming along, what that means for the technology, in what timeframes we need what technology being developed. Also eventually guiding a little bit research into different aspects of the technologies. You have seen there are these 6 dimensions of technologies where we need to develop further along the line. So that's one aspect of the roadmap. The second aspect is a roadmap is very good from a sort of also a marketing perspective. I think the mobile industry has done a very good job in showing the different generations, and so we're going off with the different generations, showing what type of services are possible in what generation. So sort of trying to market services along those lines is very beneficial, because the consumers, specifically in the consumer space, it's getting more and more difficult to understand what they need to buy, and sort of having this sort of very easy way to bundle everything into one thing makes it very easy on that aspect. And finally, the roadmap is, I felt like having led through the creation of that document, created a lot of discussions in the industry about various topics. And it's sort of like a very holistic view on the whole situation from a various aspects. It's not only technology. I was talking more on the technology side, but you've seen we try to do what are the services, what are the devices coming along, what are the needs coming along. And bring all of that together, I think, is a very good exercise to do for the industry to basically drive our industry forward.
Yeah, I mean,
Mark,
I fully agree with that. Sorry, Michael, was that you?
I was only going to add one small thing into that, because in the report we also explore the kind of how the world is evolving at different paces, and how we're moving not to a kind of a different type of digital divide, not around basic connectivity, but around the quality of that connectivity. And of course, as emerging countries kind of start to develop, they won't follow the same early roadmap as we've set out. They won't start by deploying ADSL technology and then VDSL. They won't kind of copy that roadmap. So it's kind of important for those more emerging markets to kind of understand that future that Martin explained, and then kind of look at how they can kind of leapfrog those generations and move straight to kind of all optical fiber networks. So that's also an important vision, I think, for this roadmap document.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and I'd agree with both of those sets of comments. I think a roadmap also demystifies a technology. When you're immersed in the broadband industry, all the various aspects of it and the various stages of capability are to a certain extent, they can be kind of obvious to you. But once you sit down and you try and plan it out in terms of a roadmap, it helps everybody else get their minds around what's available today, what might be coming down the road in the future. And I think what the mobile industry, I think, Marcus, you mentioned it, what the mobile industry did with 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, and so on, it became terminology that the average person in the street became comfortable with. And it would be great if we could do the same in the broadband industry, to have a general understanding from everyone as to what they might be wanting to buy and how they might be wanting to use it. Michael, maybe I could just move to you. There's a question here in terms of, obviously we're on phase 2 of this document, the roadmap document. What are the key improvements from your point of view as one of the key authors of this? What are the key improvements in this document between this version and the earlier version?
Yeah, well, as Marcus was outlining in his slides, firstly, I think we've put a lot more detail onto those use cases around the consumer applications and both enterprise and we've also started to explore those different verticals within those enterprise domains, as Marcus was outlining. It's only the start, but that's something that new that we've added on at this time. And also the last report was kind of largely focused, it wasn't entirely, but largely focused on the kind of the access part, whereas this one really starts to explore the kind of the data center interconnect and the edge compute type applications and the importance of end-to-end quality experience. So there's a lot more detail around that and how that's going to evolve going through into the future. And also, I guess the second part that we've really started to expand is in the first version of the roadmap, it was a kind of a single roadmap with all the technical characteristics in one area, and it might sometimes have in brackets residential and in brackets enterprise, whereas this time we've completely split out residential and enterprise. So there's two sets of technical characteristics as Marcus kind of set out in his slides. So there's a lot more detail there, and I think a lot more flesh on the bones, as it were.
Yeah, and you actually touched an interesting point. There's another question there, which maybe I'll throw out, to all of you and see who can pick it up. But there's a question there about, is it safe to have mission critical services hosted on the cloud? And you mentioned that in this version of the roadmap, we're more thinking in terms of the data center and the I suppose the intersection point between the network and the cloud and the data center. So from your point of view, I mean, with this question, Martin Hinga raised, is it safe to have mission critical services hosted on the cloud, especially healthcare? And that really is anything hosted on the cloud is also obviously 5 nines, 6 nines dependent on the network that brings it, that connects you to the cloud. So would you have any views on that one, Michael or Marcus or Kevin?
Yeah. Let me start off. So I personally am a strong believer that this is easily possible to do. But as you just elaborated, Martin, there is you need the networking being very reliable. You need to have this separation and isolation on the network, because you don't want to have anybody like looking into your stuff. So the whole security, privacy, and so on aspects are very, very critical. And the good thing about cloud, specifically if you do multi-cloud, you can sort of change over from one cloud to another if the network allows it to easily do that and does it very quickly. If something goes wrong, you just are at the second cloud, everything goes well. But we are not there yet. But I think that's sort of the next step towards the cloud. I mean, the cloud is today largely built for, I'm saying now, residential devices, which on themselves are not terribly reliable. So they need to reboot from time to time. They need to download and upgrade and so on. So all these things need to be dealt with. But in the time frame of a broadband 6, for sure, probably already broadband 5.5, I believe this is definitely possible, and I believe this is a way the industry will go.
Yeah.
Kevin,
you mentioned. So go ahead, Kevin.
I'll just add to that. I think it really depends on the vendor of the application that's hosting the cloud and the provider that's doing the healthcare. As we spoke, I just got an email from Amazon that their clinic is open now. So you can go to Amazon.com and go to healthcare clinic. I also, for my Apple Healthcare, I also go to HealthKit. It syncs in with my doctor and gets all the health stats to my Apple Watch and my phone, and vice versa. So I'd like to inform everybody that's all using the cloud. So the cloud application for healthcare is there today. It really we really put our faith into the end application and who's ever dealing the services like Apple or Amazon or the major vendors. So it really is that trust that consumers have to have in those vendors in order to healthcare or any mission critical to work properly.
Yeah, of course, and healthcare is a spectrum as well, ranging from some of the things you talked about, which is, at one end of the spectrum, more wellness related, forwarding data, not time specific. And at the other end of the spectrum, it's robotic heart surgery, where maybe, 5 nines, 6 nines, 7 nines reliability of your converged network cloud becomes absolutely critical. And so somewhere in that healthcare spectrum, we can be absolutely sure that the cloud and the broadband network are perfectly suitable for it. But maybe at the extreme end of that healthcare spectrum, the cloud network combination has maybe some more work to do. Kevin, could I stick with you there on a question about the demand for broadband and how it's changing in the consumer world, and how our enterprise is also evolving their broadband needs? So from the demand perspective, rather than the sort of capability of the network perspective.
Yeah, we're seeing a lot of transitional shifts into what consumers are doing and what really is the uptake on the type of applications. Things like ChatGPT took us all off guard. I mean, that's something of an OpenAI did and created this really need for always on low latency configuration when you ask a question to ChatGPT and get a response, even if you transition images. And these are just simple applications that you may not think requires a lot of bandwidth, but does require some lower latency technologies in order to get the applications done. And what we see in the enterprise space is a little bit different. We see a lot more private networks coming on board where you need a dedicated stream of technology inside the applications to make it work. And especially if our last conversation about healthcare and other mission critical like robotics, you're going to deploy more private networks that have dedicated bandwidth for those particular applications. So it would be more reliable. So you're not using the open net, you're using more of a private network. And that's where we see a lot of transitional shifts in the use of our data and how private networks can actually handle some of these future applications, which we see today, yes, they can.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that maybe that kind of points me, you talked a bit about latency there and other capabilities. And Marcus, people often, and we're as guilty as anyone, we use speed levels as a shorthand for the capabilities of broadband. We talk about GPON, a 10 GPON, a 50 GPON, or gigacities or 10 gigacities or whatever. And yet, speed is not the only characteristic, as your roadmap shows very clearly. What, from your point of view, are the key broadband characteristics that are going to become essential and be the real differentiators in the future?
Yeah. Let me first make an example, and let me make an example first, and probably Martin, and I'm sorry, you are sort of in an age that you remember that the processor speeds were the key for buying a compute node. So the processor speed was the key KPI you made the decision on. Today, I think you don't see any advertisement anymore about processor speeds. So the belief here is it's the same with broadband. There are a whole set of different characteristics and dimensions start playing into it. And I think sort of from the white paper perspective, Michael was showing like the 6 dimensions. Naturally, speed is still important. The second one is that you have this plethora of devices and things around which need connectivity. So you have a much higher number of devices which need to be connected, which also means you have a much higher number of fibers being there and need to be managed and need to be looked at and need to be maintained. Specifically, if you look into fiber to the room aspects, you multiply that. If you look into fiber to the machine, as I was elaborating, you have much higher numbers of endpoints. And the third one is a very good dimension, is sort of like having the guarantees and the good quality of experience. So these are sort of like the 3 major dimensions we are looking at for already some time. Now for broadband 5.5, we basically added 3 more dimensions. One is on the energy side. So we really need to save energy with our networks. That's not avoidable. The second aspect is this capability of using fibers also for sensing. So the technology allows to make have sensing capabilities in fibers, be it for O&M purposes or be it for other application purposes, and to sort of visualize what's going on in the network. And the last one is really, if you go into the industrial space, the very low latency, very high reliability aspect comes along. That's not that much of a residential-oriented aspect, but as said, if you control robot arms, if you have operations in the healthcare space, things need to just go on no matter what. So these are these aspects which are very important. And overall of that, the network needs to be more trusted than it probably used to be today. It comes back to the discussion we just had on healthcare, that security and privacy is a key aspect of an overall network, including the application and the data center. So I think these are sort of the main aspects which go sort of including speed, but also going beyond speed.
Yeah. I mean, Michael, would you have thoughts on that one as well, from your sort of ongoing research in this area?
Yeah, well, certainly in the consumer space, latency is becoming a more critical metric to measure. It impacts those applications in such a big way. And what's important or what's difficult about it is it's not it's not just the average latency, or it's not just the ping time that you might get. If you're on a 2-hour gaming session or a VR session, it's having that latency, as Marcus has said, on a kind of a guaranteed level. So you need to be able to have that consistent experience throughout the whole of the session. There's no point just having an average latency of, say, 5 milliseconds, but then having huge spikes of 200 milliseconds as we go on. So it's those metrics, but in a consistent way, and that's what, there's a lot of standards work going on around that in various different organizations, because it's obviously a much harder thing to try and crack than just having the average ones.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know, speaking to the manufacturing industry and wearing a different hat, I talk to the manufacturing industry a lot, and for them, I believe it's the killer app, if you want to say, is the guaranteed reliability, the determinism, if you want to use that term, but just the guaranteed reliability of the connection and the associated cloud, rather than the absolute speed. They will happily take slower speeds, even more, as you say, more reliable latency, more predictable latency. But as long as they can get the pure guaranteed SLAs that underpin that, then that is what will unleash use in some of the enterprise sectors that I speak to. Kevin, I think from the consumer side and from the demand side, you must have an insight in this as well.
Yeah, today's type of metrics that we look at obviously is speed, but we also, YouTube just brought it up, which is really great to bring up, is consistency, reliability. Those are very, very important factors, as everybody described. But I think what we need to make sure that we're keeping an eye on the end target is, in the future, with all these other applications we mentioned that are coming on board and what's going to be trending, speed is still very important, because the future applications, like we say live TV or XR experiences, you're going to need that bandwidth to actually handle those technologies. So today, speeds are really at the peak where most applications run successfully. So you got to focus on the consistency, reliability. But the next generation applications, when we see, speed's going to be obviously the forefront of our mindset, and we still got to make sure the network can handle those applications with the great amount of bandwidth that's needed.
Yeah, and I do agree with that, because obviously if you don't have enough speed, then that causes things like latency and jitter, because then that's when you start getting the buffers filling up. So I completely agree with Kevin that speed will remain very important as we go on.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good point to bring this Q&A to an end. I'm sure there's other questions we're not going to get to now, but we will try and respond to them by email. Thank you all for your participation today on the webinar and for submitting your questions and comments. For those of you who are looking at this in a playback mode, reach out to us separately or by emails, or drop questions into the WBBA, and we'll attempt to get back to you and answer you on those. I certainly would like to give a big thank you to our three presenters today, Michael, Kevin, and Marcus, for sharing their expertise, and the depth of their knowledge in this area is very impressive. We'll draw this webinar to a close now, and I thank you all very much for attending.